I'm really pleased to present these two different professionals in the alternative accountability space. And I think it's going to be a really great discussion here together. Just to briefly introduce Dr. Mims and Dr. Ruiz de Velasco. Terrance Mims comes to us. He has a master's in educational leadership and policy studies from the University of Washington, as well as his doctorate in education leadership from there. He's served many years as a secondary school teacher and principal in the Bay Area, as well as Seattle, Washington. He joined SIATech in 2020 as our superintendent and chief education officer. So we're pleased that he'll be with us. Jorge Ruiz de Velasco, apologies, has his PhD in political science from Stanford, a master's in education administration and policy analysis from Stanford, and his doctorate or Juris Doctorate from UC Berkeley. And he's been serving as the leader of the California Advisory Task Force on Alternative Schools and doing a lot of work in this space. If you could forward the slides, Deborah, please. Thank you for facilitating this session, Deborah, appreciate it. So the next slide will show, we're going to be turning it over to Dr. Mims first to talk a little bit about the perspective of an alternative school leader, and then we'll follow it up with Jorge. I have a few questions for them about alternative accountability, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So if you'd like to ask some questions, please put those in the chat and we'll get to them. Okay, Terrance, you're up first.
Needed to unmute myself. All right, very good. Well, thank you all for being here, and really excited to be in this session and looking forward to a great conversation. I would like to just start off by sharing a little bit more about SIATech. As Linda has mentioned already, SIATech is a outstanding dropout recovery program that has been around since around 1998. And typically SIATech serves around 1,500 students at a time, and cumulatively about 3,000 students a year we serve through SIATech. And on average, students come to SIATech with somewhere around a 5th grade reading level, writing level, as well as their math level. You know, the schools have been successful because of the quality relationships they've been able to build, that our staff, our teachers have been able to build with our students. You know, I've said to many folks since I've started here and getting to know SIATech and understand the work that we do, the level of commitment to serving at promise youth across this organization is admirable at a minimum. And so, you know, we are tasked with it, like others in this alternative school space, with interacting and responding to accountability measures that states put before us and ask us to attend to. And so as I have started here in the last several months and thinking about, you know, how to, for lack of a better term, take an organization that's been doing really good things for a long time, and how do we move this organization forward? How do we go from good to great, take it to the next level, and figure out how do we, you know, I've come from traditional school systems where we talk a lot about, as we do in alternative ed, about how do we create equitable systems. And so thinking about the work that SIATech does and continues to do well through partnerships with our WIOA partners, with the career pathway work that we do, how do we build a system that is equitable and meets the needs of the students that we serve here, that are at promise youth, and ensuring them the best opportunities to improve their life trajectory through our programs. And so when I've thought about and worked on this problem, I've been figuring out trying to think about what does an equitable system look like. As I've said, SIATech has done tremendous work, and we're trying to figure out how do we look at metrics, both external metrics and the state accountability system, as well as what are the components of a strong system that we need to tend to make sure that, again, that we're delivering the best outcomes for students. And so, you know, I'm really excited about this conversation with Jorge, because as I know, the task force has really worked really hard with grappling with some of these questions and thinking about, what are the levers that will incentivize instructional innovation and overall improvement for student outcomes? And then what are some of the exemplary practices and approaches to local accountability that again can help us help our students reach their greatest potential, and as I like to think about, improve their life trajectory through quality schooling. And so this is my task as a new leader of SIATech. I'm excited about the work. I'm energized about working with the folks here in our system, and then thinking again, how do we use our accountability systems to help us get better in ways that we know we need to get better, and help us discover those instructional practices that can again help us become an exemplary school in many ways.
Thank you, Terrance. Jorge, would you like to go next and talk about your work, please?
Sure. First of all, I'm really grateful for this conversation. I should say, as I was listening to Terrance talk, and particularly the challenge of finding the right leader, the levers as a leader to promote continuous learning and improvement in an organization on behalf of the young people that you serve every day. And in that, I'm most familiar, at least from the work that we've been doing here in California around state accountability and school accountability. We've been very much having this conversation about what bureaucratic or state level accountability system would create incentives for improvement and for growth in schools. And what we know is that accountability system for alternative schools like yours more often gets in the way than actually contributes to growth. And that's one of the reasons is because research shows over and over that the biggest driver of improvement is what we might call professional accountability. How people like you and your teachers and the adults in a building hold themselves accountable for connecting with young people, re-engaging them in school, and promoting academic growth. That's more powerful than state accountability. But that said, let me start with a few things about state accountability and the metrics and some of the good news that's happening in California and the direction that we're going. One really quickly is, for those who are not in California, the state has established a new accountability system that is within the federal accountability system for alternative schools, honing to the requirement that we hold schools to the same indicators for progress, but being more flexible and taking seriously using more appropriate metrics to actually measure what alternative schools do. And one of the things that a school like SIATech does, which receives an array of students, some of which are reading at the 5th grade level and some of which are aging out of the K-12 system and really need an accelerated opportunity to get the credits they need to get a diploma and to move on to the next stage of their learning, is to graduate. And that is for a credit recovery school or a dropout recovery school or program. One of the clear goals from the state is, are you providing an alternative pathway to a standards-based diploma for kids who come to you? And so for a long time on this critical goal, the way that alternative schools were measured was the 4-year cohort grad rate, which we already knew was going to be bad for your schools because you're getting kids who are off track from graduating on time by age 18. And so the state has shifted to measuring a 1-year graduation rate. And although that sounds very simple, it should be revolutionary because it will allow alternative programs like SIATech and others to actually measure what is one of their key goals, and that is for kids who are within a year of graduating, do they actually graduate with a standards-based diploma, and are you providing them an alternative path to do that? So this is really important because it's going to recognize an important goal that you have and the work that you do. the federal government does require that 11th graders in your programs be tested against the accountability system for measurement against all other 11th graders. And one thing that California is doing on that score is not lowering the standard on the standard assessments, but it is creating more cut scores at the middle and towards the bottom, so that we can differentiate both among schools and how they're doing with kids, but also giving teachers and administrators a more fine-grained idea of where they are and how their kids are growing or not growing in ways that matter. The other really important good thing that's happening in state accountability is that the state is adding more workplace learning metrics that count on what are called the college and career readiness goals and indicators. And this means that for the first time in last year and in years going forward, the state's going to be asking schools and programs to actually count and report the number of kids in your programs who complete internships, who complete state and federal jobs programs, do pre-apprenticeships, participate in student-led enterprises, or complete the Armed Forces qualifications test. And by actually measuring this, which many alternative schools do for their young kids, offer these opportunities, it will lift up the work of those schools, but we think it will also create incentives for more schools to offer these programs and to measure another very important thing they do, which is provide these workplace learning and continuation opportunities for young people. But it also will encourage districts to invest in putting those programs in alternative settings where there is, I think, going to be and always has been a big demand. They'll encourage more of these CTE pathway programs and dual enrollment with community colleges and those partnerships. But what's still missing? And that is, in California, we have an 83% statewide grad rate. Of those 15 to 17% who don't graduate on time, that's a large quantum of those kids will be enrolling in schools like SIATech and in continuation programs and other alternative options. We know that of those who do enroll in your programs, on average across the state, 60% who get within range of graduating actually do graduate within 1 year. So those are a number of kids who are on track to drop out who've now been saved from the system, from exiting without a diploma. What about the other 40%? We have a system right now that basically says, we don't care about that other 40%. We don't measure what happens to them. We don't track it. And what it does is that other 40%, we know from looking at school data that anywhere from 40 to 100% of that 40% who do not graduate from alternative programs when they are seniors or within range, don't actually drop out to the street. They make successful transitions to other programs like a GED program, a community college high school program, programs like Youth Build and the armed services and a number of other positive transitions that keep them on a track to learning and growth. But the system currently does not measure those things. And what it does is it doesn't honor the fact that a lot of your students, even if they're reading if they're 18 and 19, they're reading at 5th grade level, but they're coming back to your programs and they're showing enormous tenacity. And the teachers who meet them where they are and make sure they don't stay there are also putting together enormous effort, which is not being recognized by the system as an enormous success and the hard work that goes into actually making those transitions happen successfully. So what we need is what we still need going forward to honor the work that you guys do and lift it up and make it more visible in the system is a state system that says another important goal is helping kids who are 19, 20, 21 in the foster system, who have experienced trauma, who have other barriers to learning, to make sure that they don't leave K-12 system at 19 and 21 into the street and nowhere, that they make successful transitions, that to community college, to adult ed, to job training programs. And first, we need a system that sets that as a goal, and then that sets out to measure it by asking, as it already does for most public schools through the exit codes, to lift up and report the number of kids who are not actually dropping out of education. They are transitioning from K-12 into another continuing learning pathway, because that is super important to making sure that they reach age 24, still able to support families and to stay connected to the education system or to work that is gainful. Two other things the state can do is fully fund and reimburse programs for those things. Right now, one of the biggest inequities is the fact that kids in continuation high schools in California, or like transfer schools in New York, are only funded for half a day of work, even if the districts and schools offer a full day of instruction. Well, that sends a powerful signal to teachers, to administrators, and to students about the lack of investment and the lack of importance. But even for a school like SIATech and other schools that do get full ADA reimbursement, you know it's not enough, given all of the extra work and resources and support services that students in alternative programs need to be successful and to make successful transitions. There ought to be a funding stream that adequately funds that effort and that signals that those goals that you have for kids are important. And that is a winning of hearts and minds, not just a technical issue of dollars. It's also showing that those kids and their success matters. As I talk to principals and school leaders, the state currently does not have a credentialing program or a micro-credentialing program for leaders and teachers who go into alternative settings. That many people would find useful, because not only would it help to define the skills that teachers and principals and leaders need for schools in alternative settings, but it also would honor by showing the state's recognition of additional commitment and encouraging some of our best teachers and principals to come in to the system and work with At Promise Youth. There is a lot on the research side on what Terrance talked about. You know, the themes he laid out were about professional accountability. The fact that people like Terrance and other principals and teachers get up every morning and go to work, and they hold each other accountable to excellence on behalf of young people in their care in alternative settings. And there's much that we need to learn about how that kind of culture of strong professional accountability happens and gets built in schools like yours. The kind of teacher recruitment that you do, the support that you give to your teachers and leaders, the leadership development, the assistance and implementation of evidence-based practices, and the partnerships that the teachers and principals build with community colleges, employers, with work programs and out-of-school time expanded learning experiences. These are all more powerful than anything a state accountability system can do, but they do need resources, and they do need districts and charter managers and the state to come in behind professionals that have internal incentives to seek excellence on behalf of young people, but they need the state and their districts to get behind them. I'm going to stop there because we might have questions, and I'd like to open it up a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge, for talking us through some of the major initiatives from the state. These are elements that we talk about a lot: internal accountability, like you mentioned, and working together for the best strategic outcomes of our students, and in simultaneously making sure that we're addressing some of the external accountability from the state. And the DOS has been a tremendous improvement of creating relevance for schools like SIATech and really aligning the work that we're doing better for public consumption and consideration of what SIATech's doing. And so I have a first question, which is about demonstrating growth. And I also want to open this up. If anyone has questions, they could put it in the chat, or if you also have your own response of your opinion on this item, to please contribute. We can make this as collaborative as possible. The focus for schools like SIATech and other programs serving students who are often dramatically behind in credits and academic skills is to help students make learning gains while they're with us. So we assess students when they enroll to obtain baseline measures and really work to measure growth over time. What are some best practices for measuring and sharing results of individual student growth while students are within our schools? And are there other efforts or additional work being discussed at a research or policy level to recognize alternative schools' work to make individual learning gains for our students while they're with us? Let me just put that out there. I know some ways might be course completions, for example. Have there been, and right now there's the year over year, SBAC. I'm just curious, Jorge, at the group that you guys were discussing different metrics, did the idea of academic growth come up, and what might be some advice for schools like ours when we want to evaluate our student growth?
Yeah, I can tell Terrance is thinking really deeply about this, so I'm going to maybe I'll jump in a little bit because.
Well, yeah, go for it, Jorge. I will say something. I was in the A game session earlier, and they were talking about some of these pieces, but I'll let you go and then I'll respond.
Okay, so there's lots of the growth lights up in people's heads in lots of different ways. I just want to set out a couple of things. One, there is learning growth, which is something that that implies a kind of data about how kids are growing in their math knowledge and their reading and English and oral language and expression skills. And in many ways, states and districts can support schools, but they often need to get out of the way and let leaders and teachers figure out, given the diversity of kids and the distance from graduating that you will have in any one school, what those measures are. On the other hand, one thing that we haven't done well in California or elsewhere is measure academic progress as opposed to growth on a learning growth. And what I mean, and that is, for example, credit completion towards a diploma or to a certificate, and completion of certain other kinds of activities that signal academic engagement, like measuring the number of kids who are getting internships and doing workplace learning opportunities and so on. And so we've talked a little bit about that. What a lot of districts do for their schools is they treat kids entering their system with systems like we do for special ed, is that you create a learning plan for each individual kid and then have at set intervals measure how many of the kids are on track with their individual learning plan and how many are not, and how can we change that. And that is one best practice that we've seen in many of our districts. It's not something you'd want to be mandated at the state level, but it is something that districts ought to see. Are their schools personalizing this idea of growth and making sure that the kids are at least on track with the goals that they set up front.
Yeah, that brings to mind a conversation I was having with one of our site leaders recently on this very topic, and what she told me was that it was just below half of our students who are put into that 1-year cohort rate, or into that 1-year cohort at her school was actually graduating on schedule, meaning not moving out their graduation date. And so again, thinking about the measures that we need to identify and pay attention to for our internal accountability to figure out how we're doing or not doing in serving students, or how well we're doing in serving students and that will be a good measure. And so that was a question that I put to her, was like, well, do we know why those kids who didn't make it aren't making it? Is it because they perhaps need more support in ELL, or were they are predominantly our IEP students? And so when we start thinking about continuous improvement within our alternative schools, not looking at the state accountability external measures, but what are the things that we can do better inside of our system? What data can we track? And so that's an example of what you're speaking to there, Jorge. A couple of other things that you said earlier, and I just wanted to speak back to them as you talked about adequate funding. We invested a great deal of time the last year in trauma-informed care and practices and systems. And I guess what really stuck in my mind from your comments earlier was this adequacy of funding issue. As a school leader, as someone working in the system, we oftentimes just jump into the work and think, okay, well, how do we take what we have and get to where we're trying to go? But I'm also recognizing that the needs of our students, because many of them have experienced trauma in their lives and what they've overcome to get to where they are, they bring a host of challenges that we're trying to help them resolve, persist through, especially now in this pandemic. And so I'm thinking about the things that I need to advocate more for, which is around increasing funding for schools. Now, is that something that's going to happen straight away? Probably not. But your remarks here are reminding me of the things that we need to tend to if we really are going to create a system that's serving our students well. And one of those pieces is being adequate funding for the supports and services that we need to help them get to the next level and stay on that learning path. I'm going to turn it back over to you, moderator.
There's lots of great questions coming in, so I wanted to voice some of those. The first one, is there any system in place for middle grades alternative programs, so like grades 6 to 8, Jorge, that you know of?
I do not. I'd be interested to know if I understand a lot of our RAPSA group is from out of state, and in California there is there were prior to the last 5 years or so a good number of middle school programs, and there still are a couple legacy middle school ed options programs in California, but they're somewhat disfavored, at least at the state level. The state has been discouraging middle schools from creating alternative paths and schools, and is really sort of focused on kids over the age of 16 in alternative paths, really sort of focused on the improvement of middle schools, of traditional middle schools, rather than creating options.
Mm-hmm. The next question I can relate to. It is one of the challenges in Portland to alternative accountability is having the bandwidth to gather and process the data. How is California managing having this alternative data set while still managing the conventional systems? Thoughts on that?
Well, it if you're talking about the state level, the DOS program, there are, in every aspect of indicator that is required by the federal government, the state is collecting data for alternative schools along those same indicators, just using different metrics, which means that it uses the same data collection to populate the outcomes for both the dashboard for traditional schools and ed option schools. Because they're drawing on the same indicators like a graduation rate, it's just using the 1 year rate, but drawing on the same data. There have been there's need to be some adjustments in California, for example. What is a 12th grader? That's generally been left up to districts. And now for a proper calculation of the 1 year grad rate for alternative schools, schools really need to measure who is a 12th grader based upon number of credits. That's new and that's a change in the system, but it's handled by the same, within the same data system. So it hasn't created an additional burden to do this. In fact, I spent a little bit of time talking about creating a positive transition rate, which the Taskforce on Alternative Schools has recommended to the state board, and they're currently considering it and will be thinking about it for a proposal in next March. The irony is, since 2000, the state has been requiring schools to they've created a big system of codes and required schools to spend a lot of energy tracking down every kid who doesn't show up and who exits without a diploma, and creating a code for them and sending that information to Sacramento, and it's never reported. So lifting up the fact that in our data shows that a good number of those kids who exit are not dropping out, they're just transferring to another opportunity outside the K-12 system. That's really important, but it has not required additional data collection. It just requires additional data reporting that's important and relevant to alternative schools.
Yeah, I would say from my work in managing SIATech's data services and reporting, I think Lorna hits on a really good point, which is the blessing and the curse of having these alternative systems, because schools are then trying to report on multiple measures as accurately and thoroughly as possible so that the dashboard reflects what's actually happening at the school. But it does create an additional layer of sophistication, of strategic prioritization, of it is really, I think, a need for respect for our school data folks who are really stepping up to the challenge, but it's also so worthwhile when you can actually see more accurate reflections of how alternative schools are doing through systems like the DOS. So I think that's a really good question that was put forward. Another one touches upon this transition. How are you, I'm assuming the state, verifying the transition to a non-K-12 funded educational setting for students who either age out or chose to move on to a post-secondary environment? So maybe, Jorge, if you could talk a little bit about, exit codes and the longitudinal nature that we're trying to create in the state of California when it comes to identifying students when they leave us, even if they're going to a program that's perhaps outside of the current CalPAD system.
Yeah, with the advent of the cohort graduation rate, it represented a big quantum leap in the data burden on districts to count every kid that's graduating on time, but also confirm the enrollment of kids that leave to other education programs so that they're not counted as dropouts on your ledger, but rather as transfers. And so with that, there was already a quantum leap in the tracking of students. I'm not familiar what it looks like for other states. But my impression is already, just on the data side, California has actually had a high burden, placed a high burden on schools to track multiple measures of data, but has not always used that data to highlight positive things that are going on. And so the one area really where there is growth and complexity, and this falls to small schools everywhere, it is not a new problem. And it's not one that is created by additional data collection for alternative schools, is that small districts and don't have really the data capacity people to collect and do good and high faith data collection and analysis and reporting to the federal government. So then a lot of this actually falls to classroom teachers and counselors in the smaller schools to constantly be creating spreadsheets and putting those information into computers that then get reported on different platforms. This is not new, and really the only ratcheting up of data, which I think is worth the additional effort, is on these new college and career readiness indicators for the high school students. You've never had to track the number of kids who did internships or the ones who completed job programs or who got certificates like the food handler certificates or the health safety certificates that are required for people who want to go into, start a business as a hair cutter or a colorist, or in OSHA jobs that are OSHA regulated. You've never had to count those, and now the state wants you to do that so that it can honor the schools that are making efforts to help kids get those kinds of certificates. I think it's worth it, but you're right, it is a huge cost, and it's a burden on people who need to teach or counsel and also maintain spreadsheets and report them to Sacramento.
Thank you. We have several more questions, but I want to pause there for a moment to ask Terrance too, if you want to weigh in on the need, for creating relevance when students are with us for a post-secondary outcome, college and career readiness while they're in a high school that may not be recognized by an external accountability system, but is still some activities to create relevance for students. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything you want to weigh in when it comes to thinking about transitioning students after graduation that may not be captured in an accountability system.
I'm not certain how to answer that question, Linda, but what I'm thinking about is what we're working on, us at SIATech, as we think about building an accountability system that measures the things that we should be paying attention to in order to hold ourselves accountable to improve our programs. And one of them that I hear you all talking about, or I think about, is, I know there's that national clearinghouse data, the persistence data. And I think that's what, when I think about what Jorge is speaking to, which is, yes, we collect all these, when students drop out and they're no longer in our system, where do they go? And then also for students who do graduate and go to college, we do, some systems, many districts do track their national clearinghouse data. And I'm thinking of how do we, as we think about going forward, how do we put in place a system where we are thinking about that pathway, as 70% of our students actually graduate is roughly what I think it is, Linda. And then, the other 30% don't graduate. And so I'm thinking about, what does happen to those students? And so, what can we do to track their progress? Do they enter other programs? And so I don't know that I have a great answer for the question you asked me, but I can tell you that I'm really benefiting from hearing Jorge's conversation around the things that we should and could be doing, and looking forward to putting some of those practices and some of those accountability pieces in place so that we can get better in serving students, which is, as I said at the top, my problem of practice writ large around my responsibilities at SIATech. So.
And you bring up a good point. National Student Clearinghouse, Lori, is a great resource to track that post K-12 activity of students. So I encourage you to look into that if you're not already using it.
And what I want to say to that is, if we can find a way to track students beyond their years with us, and to demonstrate as a way to demonstrate the effectiveness of our programs, that we're supporting students, that we're putting them on the right paths, to go to a community college, to go to a career opportunity program, someplace where they're going to develop those skills. As Jorge and I spoke a few days ago in conversation around, understanding that we serve the 16 to 24-year-olds, and many of them don't reach their, aren't fully connected until they get to the age of 24. Now, are we able to, commit to tracking them all the way through? Perhaps not, but let's at least try and build a system where we can put them on that path, and then help them make those connections. And so, as you think, so your question around, pathways and relevancy, I believe our chief task is to recognize that a lot of our students are not going to, find their way to their next chapter, that life trajectory changing program necessarily with us. And so, how do we help them? How do we create a SIATech that builds that pathway out broadly, and that we help students get on that pathway, and help them again get to where they would like to be, where we would like them to be, in by the age of 24 or 21 or 22, or beyond their high school years.
Linda, if I just might add on this, lots of times in thinking about the burden of data collection and tracking versus the benefit to your organization, to the school, what I've heard is that this tracking of where kids go when they leave or when they stop showing up is a burden, and it's complicated because it bridges institutional boundaries. But it is often, it's an event. It's like it's one kid at a time, and just finding out what happened. It's sometimes a phone call, and it can be more complicated. But there's a clear benefit to tracking that. However, their attendance, for example, is something that is not an event, or at least a one-off event. It is something that happens every single day. And what leaders, particularly in alternative schools, is saying, taking attendance is very time consuming for the payoff at the high school level. That is, and in alternative schools in particular, having to take either period attendance or daily attendance. There are reasons for some, but it can be an enormous burden. And then calculating an attendance rate for an alternative schools, many leaders say it doesn't matter for them. They would get more bang for their buck spending time tracking kids' progress and credits than they do tracking whether they showed up at a particular place and time on any given day. Because for a 16, 17, 18-year-old, and we're learning a lot of this during the pandemic, that attendance becomes a weaker signal of engagement. In elementary school, attendance is a strong signal of engagement, which is one reason that you take attendance and report it. But not so that a lot of high school leaders say, I'm not sure that's the case, which really an indicator is, what are our kids producing, and how are we helping them to do that, and spending less time finding out where they are across a day every day. It'd be interesting to know where some of your members and people on the forum fall on that, because and also at the end of the year, you get this attendance rate or chronic absenteeism rate that for many alternative schools just isn't very meaningful.
Yes, those are really good points. And even, absenteeism hasn't been applied to high schools in recent years, but then sometimes I think it was just published excused versus unexcused absences. And sometimes it catches us by surprise when we're using the DOS. And I want to go back. There's been some great conversation in the chat, so thanks everyone. Keep chatting in there. Question about how have you navigated the tension between creating an alternative accountability system that tracks and measures the real work schools are doing while maintaining credibility in the face of traditional accountability systems? And I think this has come up recently for me personally, because I've been contacted by folks that are looking to apply for DOS, but they're getting some maybe pushback from their local boards. So I'm curious, Jorge, if you could talk a little bit about creating credibility around alternative school system or accountability systems.
Well, so the challenge here is helping boards, including the state board, recognize what work they're asking alternative schools to do and what success looks like for them. So if you apply, say, a proficiency score, and you want to know how are all kids doing against this proficiency score, and then you create schools for kids who are not meeting the proficiency score. And then you say, well, they're all failing because they're not reading the proficiency score. Well, basically, it's sort of like a tautological argument. You're not actually measuring these schools against what you want them to do. And that is to measure growth and to help find alternative pathways to stay reengaged. Or since part of what this system, the traditional system measures is on-time graduation, and you've created a school for kids that are not on track, then what's the goal for them? And so that's the real challenge, is that neither the states particularly has ever articulated a clear goal for kids who are off track. And one of those clear goals should be continuing to make progress past age 18 and transitions to work and continuing education. That the state needs to declare that as a goal so that it will be, so that they can create an accountability system that's legitimately measuring that goal and saying, that's what success looks like in this school. What we've had for a long time, and what many states have, are systems that say, for kids who are failing, we're going to put them in schools, and then we have a system that says, and those schools are failing, because of who we put in the schools, not because of anything those schools are doing or not doing. And that's an enormous disincentive for every adult that goes every day to that school to put their shoulder to the wheel of making the effort to do the best thing they can to help those kids make progress, is to live in an accountability system that says, no matter what you do, you're failing. If that's it's just like if the definition of cruel and unusual punishment for an educator, that would be it.
And then you under-resource those schools so that, and knowing the additional needs and supports that those students actually need in order to reach whatever goal we set for them. So no, that's a very good point, and that resonates.
So I wanted to, we have about 10 minutes left, just give each of our panelists a chance to weigh in, kind of like on a bit of a vision and outlook, considering the global pandemic, considering, recent election results showing a divided nation. And also, just the awakening on the need to address systemic racism and social injustice of our institutions. What are each of your thoughts for how alternative schools should approach and respond to these issues, or closing thoughts for helping us all, especially our schools, move forward in light of all these events? Any forward-looking comments?
That's a big question there, Linda Leigh. Wow, you're going for the home run.
I have so Terrance has more experience with this than I do, so I'll go first so that I don't look.
I don't think that'll be the case, sir, but go for it.
But I was at a session just before this one that was looking at the New York City's transfer schools, which are their version of continuation high schools in New York City. And it's a very large system, large number of schools. I was struck by a survey that they had taken. And they said that the majority, I believe, I forget the exact number, but it was more than half of the students who enrolled in alternative schools reported on their way in as part of induction, or having students reflect on being inducted into a school like SIATech or a transfer school. Majority of students said they were surprised. They were surprised to meet adults who cared about them and their learning. It was a bracing comment. To live in a world where you are surprised to find an adult who cares. So in this moment, I think the flip side needs to be recognized that a very important thing that alternatives do, and that as a driver of equity, is re-engage kids in learning, helping them feel like they belong in school and that somebody cares about their learning, and creates bridges to them between where you are and the next place they need to be, and the people out there who are going to care to help them get to the next place. The bonding and the bridging that happens in schools like yours is super critical to driving equity. And so this pandemic and this moment is one not to be wasted, as some principles say. Don't waste the pandemic, and don't waste this national argument about equity and racial justice, because it does open opportunities to engage young people in peer-to-peer conversations, in adult-to-peer conversations, that step one is showing we acknowledge the inequity in the system and we care about it, and we care about you. And inviting that conversation is like the first step to unlocking the mindsets that really help people address those inequities. So it's a good moment to do that. I just want to think of this as an opportunity.
Well, I think Jorge spoke very well to your question. As a practitioner, I will say first that, as Jorge pointed out, the foundational piece of teaching and learning in that teacher-student relationship is the relationship between the teacher and the student. And we know that from all types of research around intrinsic motivation and how do we create classroom and learning environments where students are successful. And so, we have that in spades at SIATech, that I know that our teachers care deeply about our students. And it does surprise me to hear what Jorge has said about, what students shared in coming into their schools, that to know that there was one caring adult who was concerned about their well-being. So I fully embrace that thinking. How do we not lose this moment? How do we make sure we take advantage of it? I've been on this equity-driven journey for a while, and have come to believe that awareness becomes critically important, and this is an opportunity for us to talk about awareness, and for schools and across our country we know that that most of our teachers, most of the folks who work in our system don't look like the students that they serve. And so there is a great deal of work to be done around developing awareness about the experiences of students of color, their communities, how bias, discrimination, systemic racism, all those oppressive factors have played out over time. And you know, what we're thinking about now is, you know, of course, you know, a lot of the challenges that we try and resolve, handle, challenges of schooling students who come from marginalized communities aren't really problems that schools created, but we're tasked with trying to solve those problems. I think we did a little professional development a few weeks ago around developing awareness across SIATech, and it was interesting, some responses from folks who thought, wow, this was, you know, we talked about redlining and how segregated communities were created over time. And so, you know, having a deeper understanding of the history of race and schooling in this country is critically important to helping students, to helping our teachers who oftentimes don't have the background experiences and knowledge of those students' cultures, backgrounds, and life stories, to be able to get our teachers to be able to, again, have a deeper and better understanding of the social injustices that have occurred over many years in this country, and then help them think again about how can we engage students in ways that that allow with their experiences to be recognized and valued and built upon, you know, as funds of knowledge to drive their learning, you know, through our schools. So that's my thought on how we might use this moment, but that's from my practitioner's point of view.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, I love that we were able to bring it back, you know, to the importance of the caring adult, to valuing every student, that they're not just a number or a metric, but really building those relationships so that they feel attached and connected and moving in an area of growth. So thank you all for participating and joining us. I want to remind you all the awards ceremony starts at 1 o'clock. We'll be honoring Jorge, who was nominated and selected as an award winner this year. So excited to be there with you. Thank you so much, Terrance, for sharing your thoughts as well. And thanks everyone for the wonderful chat. This stays live, so you're able to come back in, and some resources were pasted there, so you can come back and grab those at a later time. So thank you all so much for coming, and thanks to our presenters. Deborah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys soon.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you, everybody. And like Linda said, don't forget to complete your session feedback. Visit the sponsor exhibit booths that open at lunchtime. And the RAPSA award ceremony will start at 1. All of the information you need to join those sessions is in the agenda. Thanks again, everybody. See you later.